Mom spent 7 years poisoning me for internet likes. Now, I've given her the series finale she always wanted. These weren't the words of a bitter adult seeking revenge. They came from a 12-year-old boy sitting calmly on a motel curb waiting to be arrested for double homicide. Michael Turner had just killed both his parents with calculated precision, and he wanted to make sure the police got his journal for evidence. But here's what makes this case unlike anything you've ever heard. Michael wasn't crazy. He wasn't evil. He was a child who'd discovered his mother had been systematically torturing him since he was 5, filming his suffering, monetizing his fake illness, and collecting over $140,000 from strangers who believed he was dying of cancer, a cancer he never had. And when a judge sentenced this abuse victim to life without parole, it sparked a question that still divides America today. When does survival become murder? If this case already has you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, you're not alone. This is one of the most controversial true crime cases in modern American history, and we're breaking down every shocking detail. Hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into cases that challenge our understanding of right and wrong, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today. Detective Hansen had seen a lot in his 22 years with the Kansas City Police Force, but nothing quite prepared him for what he encountered on that cold October morning at the Starlight Motel. The call had come in at 4:17 in the morning, a child reporting that he'd just killed his parents. When Hansen arrived at the scene, he found Michael Turner sitting on the curb outside room 118, a Spider-Man backpack placed neatly beside him, looking for all the world like a student waiting to be picked up after school, except for the specks of blood visible on his tennis shoes and the faint smell of gunpowder that clung to his clothes. The boy's blue eyes tracked the detective's movements with unsettling precision, his hands resting calmly in his lap without a tremor, not a single tear having fallen despite the horror that lay just feet away behind the thin motel door. When Hansen approached, Michael's first question wasn't about what would happen to him or whether he could call someone. It was whether they needed to wait for crime scene photographers before collecting his journal, a query that revealed both his methodical nature and his remarkable understanding of police procedure for someone barely into puberty. Inside room 118, the scene was both brutal and oddly controlled. Reeba and Ernie Turner lay in their respective beds, each killed by a single shotgun blast while they slept. The blood spatter patterns told a story of calculated execution rather than panicked violence. The shooter had stood approximately 3 feet from each bed, firing first at Ernie Turner, then calmly repositioning to fire at Reeba. There was no sign of struggle, no defensive wounds, nothing to suggest the victims had even known what was coming. The shotgun itself had been methodically dismantled, its parts divided between Michael's duffel bag and a motel ice bucket filled with bleach. A rudimentary but surprisingly sophisticated attempt at destroying forensic evidence. Crime lab technicians discovered an unfired shotgun shell under one of the beds bearing Michael's fingerprints, suggesting he'd brought backup ammunition in case his first shots failed. The kind of contingency planning that seemed impossible for a 12-year-old mind to conceive. The blood spatter on Michael's clothing was minimal and concentrated only on his shoes and jean cuffs, indicating he'd changed clothes immediately after the shootings, another sign of premeditation that would later become central to the prosecution's case. The journal recovered from Michael's Spider-Man backpack would become the cornerstone of everything that followed. A leather-bound book with his name embossed on the cover, containing 117 pages that chronicled not just the planning of a double homicide, but what appeared to be years of medical abuse at the hands of his mother. The pages contained detailed sketches of the motel room layout with precise measurements, ballistic calculations for a 20-gauge shotgun designed to avoid penetrating adjacent walls, and a timeline marking when motel staff would be on break, critical information for ensuring privacy during the commission of murder. But interspersed with these technical diagrams were devastating personal entries that painted a picture of a child's growing awareness that something was terribly wrong with his life. One entry from September read about overhearing his parents fighting about the new treatment, with his father saying it was getting too expensive and risky now that Michael was getting older and might start telling people he didn't feel sick, while his mother insisted they'd come too far to stop and could make another $50,000 from a Final Journey fundraiser if they played it right. The most damning entries were written in Michael's careful, almost adult penmanship just days before the murders, stating that his mom thought he didn't know about the blog. His dad thought he didn't know about the money. And they thought the doctors hadn't told him the truth yet. But tomorrow they would understand he'd known everything for months. Michael's initial statement to Detective Hansen, delivered without prompting and without the presence of an attorney, was recorded by the detective's body camera and would later send chills through the courtroom when played at trial. Standing beside the patrol car with his small hands cuffed in front of him, Michael had looked directly at the camera and stated matter-of-factly that he'd had to do it before they could put him away forever, and that everyone would understand when they read about what his parents had done to him. It was all in his medical records and in her stupid blog where she told everyone he was dying. The dispatcher who'd taken Michael's initial 911 call described his voice as robotic, like he was ordering a pizza, as he calmly reported 2 deceased persons at the Starlight Motel and provided his exact location. The recording captured Michael giving his full name, stating his age, confirming he'd just killed his parents with his father's shotgun, and politely asking officers to please send someone to arrest him. When the dispatcher asked if he was armed or if anyone else was injured, his response was equally measured. He'd unloaded the gun and put the parts in bleach. No one else was hurt, and he'd made sure no one in neighboring rooms would be in danger from the shots. As crime scene technicians processed the motel room, they discovered several items in Michael's backpack that suggested this wasn't simply a spontaneous act of violence, but something far more calculated and disturbing. Besides the journal, the backpack contained several prescription medication bottles with Reeba Turner's name as the patient, though the contents appeared to be a variety of pills that didn't match the labels, evidence that Michael had been collecting to prove his mother's fraud. He'd also packed his birth certificate, immunization records, and several USB drives, carefully labeled as Mom's Blog Backup and Medical Records 2016 to 2023, items that investigators would later determine were collected deliberately to provide evidence of his mother's years of medical abuse. The methodical nature of this evidence collection spoke to a level of planning and foresight that seemed impossible for someone so young, yet there it was, neatly organized in a child's backpack decorated with cartoon characters. Within hours of the discovery, these USB drives would reveal a digital empire of deception. A blog called Michael's Brave Journey, with over 12,000 subscribers, hundreds of fundraising posts, and years of carefully curated content showing a sick child's battle with cancer that medical records would soon prove had never existed. By mid-morning, the story had reached national news networks as the chilling details emerged about the child who had meticulously planned his parents' deaths. Michael's school photo, showing a thin, pale child with hollow eyes and a forced smile, was broadcast alongside images of the crime scene, creating a visual juxtaposition that troubled viewers across the country. Local reporters discovered that Michael had been homeschooled for the previous 3 years due to what his parents claimed were complex medical needs, though neighbors interviewed on camera noted they'd rarely seen the boy outside and had been told by Reeba that he suffered from a rare form of leukemia requiring constant care and specialized treatments. The contrast between the composed child sitting in police custody and the horrific violence of the crime scene created a cognitive dissonance that would define public reaction to the case. How could someone so young, so small, so seemingly innocent-looking have executed such a brutal and calculated act. Detective Hansen would later testify that, in his decades on the force, he'd never encountered a juvenile suspect who appeared so detached, so eerily composed, in the immediate aftermath of such brutality, as if Michael had compartmentalized the horror of what he'd done behind an impenetrable wall of calm rationality. As the Kansas City sun rose higher over the Starlight Motel, curious onlookers gathered beyond the police tape, their whispered speculations growing louder as word spread that the perpetrator was just a child, a boy whose feet dangled above the floor when he sat in the back of Hansen's police car. The motel clerk who'd checked the family in the previous day told investigators that Reeba and Ernie had arrived around 7 in the evening, looking tired from their drive, while Michael had actually checked into the room earlier that morning, a discrepancy that would later prove crucial to establishing premeditation. Security footage from a nearby gas station showed Michael arriving at the motel alone via taxi around 10:15 that morning, carrying his backpack and duffel bag nearly 9 hours before his parents showed up. 9 hours he'd spent setting up what prosecutors would later describe as an ambush. The methodical timeline painted by this evidence suggested a level of patience and planning that seemed incompatible with the image of a frightened child acting in desperate self-defense. Yet the contents of that journal and those USB drives would soon reveal a nightmare that complicated every easy assumption about the case. The transformation of public perception began almost immediately as investigators started piecing together the scope of Reeba Turner's deception. Kansas City Children's Hospital was contacted by authorities, and Dr. Ella Mercer, head of pediatric oncology, confirmed that while Michael had been treated there sporadically over the past 4 years, there had been increasing concerns among staff about potential medical child abuse. The hospital had actually flagged the Turner case for review the following month, with medical professionals noting discrepancies in symptom reports, inconsistencies in blood work compared to the mother's descriptions, and the concerning fact that Michael had begun asking questions suggesting he didn't understand why he was receiving treatments for an illness he didn't feel he had. In hindsight, Dr. Mercer told investigators with professional regret evident in her voice they should have escalated their concerns to authorities much sooner. But Munchausen, by proxy cases, are notoriously difficult to identify and prosecute because the perpetrators are typically articulate, devoted-seeming caregivers who've become skilled at manipulating medical systems, changing providers when suspicions arise, and creating elaborate documentation that appears legitimate on superficial review. By the time Michael Turner sat in that juvenile detention cell, investigators were beginning to understand that they weren't dealing with a simple case of a child who'd snapped in a moment of rage. They were unraveling one of the most severe examples of medical child abuse in Kansas City history, and the boy who'd ended it with violence was simultaneously perpetrator and victim in ways that would challenge everything the justice system thought it knew about criminal responsibility. Reeba Turner's blog, Michael's Brave Journey, was a master class in digital manipulation and emotional exploitation that had been running for over 5 years by the time Michael discovered its true nature. The blog had accumulated more than 12,000 dedicated followers who tuned in regularly to read Reeba's beautifully written, emotionally charged updates about her son's supposed battle with a rare and aggressive form of leukemia. The posts were perfectly crafted to maximize emotional impact, with Reeba displaying a sophisticated understanding of what content generated the most engagement and financial support. Analytics recovered from her laptop showed that posts containing medical crisis updates or hospital photos received 340% more engagement and donation activity than general updates, creating a perverse feedback loop that incentivized increasingly dramatic medical scenarios. Reeba posted an average of 12 times per week, maintaining a consistent narrative voice that painted her as the devoted, exhausted, but ever hopeful mother standing by her brave warrior son through every setback and small victory. She'd built an entire community around Michael's fabricated illness, with followers organizing local fundraisers, sending care packages, and forming online prayer groups dedicated to his recovery. All of it based on a lie that was slowly killing the very child they thought they were helping. The financial scope of Reeba's deception was staggering when forensic accountants finally pieced together the full picture. Over the course of 7 years, she'd raised approximately $140,000 through various online fundraising platforms, all dedicated to Michael's battle with the cancer he never had. Bank records revealed that while this substantial sum had been donated by well-meaning strangers who believed they were helping pay for experimental treatments and medical expenses not covered by insurance, less than 30% appeared to have been spent on anything remotely classified as medical care. The majority of funds were used for the Turner family's general living expenses, home renovations including a $12,000 hot tub installed 6 months before the murders, and a European vacation taken by Reeba alone in 2022, ostensibly to research experimental treatments, though no medical appointments or facility visits could be documented. Reeba had even strategically timed her emergency posts to coincide with paydays, and the first of each month, when her analytics showed followers were more likely to have disposable income for donations, demonstrating a level of calculated exploitation that went far beyond even typical Munchausen by proxy cases. The money wasn't just a side benefit of her psychological need for attention. It had become a significant income stream that both Reeba and Ernie had come to depend on, creating a financial incentive to keep Michael sick that made their crime even more heinous. But the true horror of Reeba's abuse wasn't just in the money or the online attention. It was in the systematic physical torture she inflicted on her son to create and maintain the illusion of his illness. When investigators searched the Turner family home, they discovered a hidden compartment in Reeba's closet containing dozens of prescription medications, many of which were powerful chemotherapy drugs that would cause extreme nausea, hair loss, and lethargy in a healthy child. These weren't medications that could be easily obtained. Ernie Turner's position as a pharmaceutical sales representative had given him access to samples and supplies that Reeba then administered to Michael to create the symptoms she needed for her blog content. A locked drawer in Reeba's desk contained detailed notes that read like a scientist's experimental log, documenting which medications she'd given Michael, the resulting symptoms, and even photographs of his physical deterioration, all organized chronologically in folders labeled for different fundraising campaigns. Detective Hansen described the discovery as a mother's detailed record of slowly poisoning her child, complete with notes on which symptoms generated the most sympathy and financial support online. Essentially a handbook for medical torture optimized for social media engagement. The medical evidence painted an even more disturbing picture when specialists began reviewing Michael's complete treatment history across 17 different healthcare facilities. Dr. Eleanor Whitman, the court-appointed independent medical examiner, spent 3 weeks analyzing thousands of pages of documentation and identified what she called the most systematic case of medical child abuse she'd encountered in 30 years of practice. From approximately age 5, Michael had been subjected to 327 unnecessary medical procedures, including 9 surgeries, 43 endoscopies, and hundreds of blood draws and biopsies. He'd been administered at least 5 different medications known to cause severe nausea, fatigue, and pain, medications that had no legitimate therapeutic purpose given his actual health status. The pattern was always the same. Reeba would report symptoms to a doctor, often symptoms that Michael himself denied experiencing, then seek increasingly aggressive treatments when initial interventions didn't resolve the fabricated problems. When doctors became suspicious or began questioning the diagnosis, Reeba would simply switch to a new provider, using 14 different hospitals and healthcare facilities across the Kansas City metropolitan area to prevent any single medical professional from seeing the full picture of her abuse. Michael's physical development provided stark evidence of the toll this abuse had taken on his young body. Comparison of his growth charts from early childhood to his pre-adolescent years showed a dramatic decline from the 50th percentile for height and weight at age 5 to below the 5th percentile by age 11. Side-by-side photographs from his kindergarten school picture compared to images from just months before, the murders showed a shocking transformation from a healthy, robust child with bright eyes and full cheeks to a gaunt, hollow-eyed boy who appeared years younger than his actual age, with visible hair loss and the pale, wasted complexion characteristic of chronic illness or malnutrition. This physical stunting was consistent with years of unnecessary chemotherapy drugs and deliberate poisoning, with medical experts testifying that the damage to his developing body might never fully reverse, even if the abuse stopped. The photographs that Reeba had shared on her blog, meant to generate sympathy and donations, were actually documentary evidence of her systematic torture of her son. Each image of Michael, looking progressively sicker, was a testament not to his brave battle with cancer, but to his mother's increasing sophistication in making him appear and feel genuinely ill. What made Reeba's abuse particularly insidious was how she'd isolated Michael from anyone who might question the narrative or offer him help. He'd been pulled from traditional school 3 years before the murders, supposedly due to his complex medical needs and weakened immune system, but investigators would later determine this was actually because Michael had begun asking his teachers questions that suggested he didn't understand why he was so sick when he felt fine between his mother's treatment sessions. Homeschooling allowed Reeba complete control over Michael's social interactions, limiting his contact with peers who might notice inconsistencies in his supposed illness or provide him with alternative perspectives on his situation. His online teachers described a bright, engaged student whose academic performance was remarkably strong despite his alleged serious illness, but they also noted something unsettling about his creative writing, essays that often focused on characters who were misunderstood or falsely accused, protagonists who had to take justice into their own hands because the adults in authority wouldn't listen. His math teacher remembered that Michael showed particular aptitude for geometry and physics, interests that would take on sinister significance when investigators discovered the ballistic calculations in his journal, but at the time simply seemed like the intellectual curiosity of a gifted student. The discovery of Reeba's laptop and the contents of those USB drives that Michael had so carefully labeled revealed the full scope of her digital empire of deception. Technical forensics experts found that she'd spent an average of 4 hours daily maintaining the blog, responding to supporters, coordinating fundraising events, and managing her social media presence across multiple platforms, essentially treating the exploitation of her son's fabricated illness as a full-time job. Her laptop contained thousands of emails exchanged with followers, many sharing their own tragic stories of children with cancer or other serious illnesses, emotional confessions that Reeba had callously used to refine her own deceptive narrative and make it more convincing. She'd even been working with a filmmaker on a documentary tentatively titled A Mother's Devotion that had attracted preliminary interest from a streaming service, a project that would have brought even more attention and money while further cementing Michael's false identity as a dying child. The blog's archive showed that Reeba had been documenting Michael's supposed illness since he was 5 years old, with early posts describing his initial diagnosis in emotional, heart-wrenching detail that thousands of strangers had believed and responded to with overwhelming support, never suspecting they were funding and emotionally validating a mother's torture of her child. Perhaps most devastating were the videos Reeba had filmed and shared on her blog, hundreds of clips showing Michael in various states of genuine suffering that she deliberately caused. There was footage of him vomiting violently after what Reeba called his treatments, but what medical experts now believed were deliberately administered toxins. Videos of him unconscious in hospital beds, surrounded by equipment that later investigation revealed had been largely unnecessary. And countless clips of a pale, exhausted child struggling to smile for the camera while his mother narrated his brave journey for her audience. In one particularly disturbing video clip that the defense would later play in court, when a filmmaker working on the documentary asked Michael directly about how his diagnosis had affected him emotionally, the boy began to say something before Reeba cut him off mid-sentence, interrupting to say he wondered if he'd lived to see high school, but that they stayed positive one day at a time. The footage showed Michael's expression briefly flashing with what jurors would later describe as suppressed rage before returning to the vacant compliance that characterized most of his appearances in his mother's media projects. These videos were supposed to be evidence of Reeba's devotion and Michael's courage, but they were actually recordings of ongoing abuse, documentary proof of a mother systematically destroying her son's childhood and health, while thousands of strangers unknowingly cheered her on and opened their wallets to fund the torture. Michael Turner's journal wasn't just a diary, it was a roadmap to murder that prosecutors would use to argue he deserved to be tried as an adult, despite being only 12 years old. The leather-bound book with his name embossed on the cover had been a gift, possibly from his parents, which added a layer of irony to its eventual use as the primary evidence against him in their murder trial. The 117 pages alternated between technical diagrams that could have come from an engineering textbook and devastating personal accounts of a child's growing awareness that his entire life was built on lies. On one page would be precise measurements of the Starlight Motel's layout, showing room 118's position relative to other rooms, the thickness of walls based on building code standards for that type of construction, and angles of fire carefully plotted to avoid structural supports. On the facing page would be an entry dated weeks earlier, describing how Michael had discovered archive videos from his mother's blog and realized that everything she'd told him about his illness was a lie, that he'd been throwing up and in pain for years, not because he was sick, but because they were deliberately poisoning him while collecting money from strangers by pretending he was dying. The ballistic calculations found in Michael's journal demonstrated a level of mathematical sophistication and practical understanding that seemed impossible for a seventh grader, yet there they were, worked out with the kind of careful precision that suggested multiple drafts and revisions. Michael had calculated the spread pattern of pellets from a 20-gauge shotgun at close range, accounting for factors like choke type and ammunition load to determine the optimal distance from his targets that would ensure lethality while preventing overpenetration of the motel's thin walls. He'd researched online using search queries like how to make a shotgun shot not go through walls and what's the spread pattern of buckshot at 3 feet, searches that investigators recovered from the family computer and that painted a damning picture of premeditation. His math teacher would later testify that Michael had created word problems for their tutoring sessions involving trajectory and velocity, calculations that matched almost exactly those found in his journal. At the time, she'd praised his creativity in applying mathematical concepts to real-world scenarios, but now she realized with horror that he'd been using their educational sessions to calculate the ballistics for the murders he was planning. The timeline documented in Michael's journal showed that he'd begun actively planning the murders at least 4 months before they occurred, though the psychological journey that led to that decision had started earlier. Entries from May 2023 described finding his mother's videos and realizing the full scope of the deception, with Michael writing in increasingly desperate terms about feeling trapped between continuing to endure the abuse and finding some way to escape it. By June, His entries showed him systematically exploring every possible avenue for help. He wrote about telling nurses that he didn't need the medicine and that it made him throw up for days, but they just smiled and told him his mom loved him very much and he needed to take his medicine to get better. He documented calling a child protection hotline only to have the case closed without investigation after Reeba convinced the caseworker that Michael's claims were delusions caused by his medication. He described overhearing his parents fighting about what to do as he got older and started questioning things more persistently, with his father expressing concern that they were losing control and his mother insisting they could manage the situation if they just got more aggressive with his treatment regimen. Each failed attempt to get help was meticulously recorded, creating a paper trail that would become crucial to his defense strategy even as the prosecution used the same entries to argue he'd methodically ruled out alternatives before choosing murder. The physical evidence supporting the prosecution's case for premeditation was overwhelming when combined with the journal entries. The unfired shotgun shell discovered under one of the beds at the crime scene bore Michael's fingerprints and matched exactly to ammunition from his father's gun cabinet at their suburban home 15 miles from the motel. Proof that Michael had taken the weapon and ammunition from his house before traveling to the motel, rather than accessing them in a moment of panic or fear. Bank records showed 23 cash withdrawals from Michael's personal savings account over 4 months, small amounts of $40 or $60 that totaled approximately $980, matching almost exactly the combined cost of 2 motel rooms, cab fare, and food. Security footage from Kansas City First National Bank showed Michael making one of these withdrawals 3 months before the murders, dressed in a baseball cap and sunglasses despite being indoors, what prosecutors characterized as an attempt at disguise, though the defense would later argue he wore sun protective gear because he believed he was undergoing chemotherapy that caused photosensitivity. The methodical accumulation of funds over time, rather than a single large withdrawal that might have alerted his parents, demonstrated what prosecution experts called sophisticated financial planning designed to avoid detection. Planning, they argued, was unusual and telling for a 12-year-old. The most damning evidence of Michael's planning came from his activities in the 48 hours before the murders, a timeline that prosecutors would use to demolish any suggestion of impulsive action or sudden panic. Terrence Mulligan, night clerk at the Stardust Inn, testified that Michael had checked in alone around 7 p.m. the night before the shootings, paying cash for one night and giving the name Mark Thompson, a false identity that prosecutors argued showed consciousness of guilt and intent to avoid detection. Security footage showed Michael arriving alone with his backpack and duffel bag, no adult ever joining him despite his claim to the clerk that his father was parking the car. He'd spent that night at the Stardust using their free Wi-Fi to access the online reservation system for the Starlight Motel and creating a reservation under his father's name for the following night, specifically requesting room 118 because it was at the far end of the building away from the ice machine and vending areas. The next morning, cab driver Vernon Harris picked Michael up from the Stardust and drove him directly to the Starlight Motel, stopping at an ATM on the way, where Michael withdrew several $100s in cash, money that would never be accounted for, but that prosecutors suggested might have been intended for his escape or survival after the murders. Michael's internet search history, recovered from the family computer, provided a comprehensive picture of his research and planning in the months leading up to the homicides. Besides the ballistic calculations and motel searches, investigators found dozens of queries related to how to tell if someone is poisoning you, a Munchausen by proxy syndrome, effects of chemotherapy drugs on healthy people, and whether minors could check into motels alone. But the defense would point out that these searches existed in a larger context that included hundreds of earlier searches about medical child abuse, how to report abuse to authorities, and what to do if doctors won't believe you're not sick. queries that predated any weapon-related searches by months, and suggested Michael had first tried to find legitimate help before ever considering violence. The chronology mattered enormously to both sides, with prosecutors arguing that the progression from research about his abuse to research about killing his abusers showed calculated escalation toward murder, while the defense maintained it showed a desperate child exhausting every legitimate option before reluctantly concluding violence was his only escape from ongoing torture and impending institutionalization. The prosecution built its case for adult jurisdiction largely on what Bailey Ward called the defendant's sophisticated understanding of forensic countermeasures and witness avoidance, evidence that she argued demonstrated adult-level criminal thinking. Michael had dismantled the shotgun after the killings and placed the parts in bleach in an attempt to destroy forensic evidence, showing knowledge of how investigators collect and process physical evidence. He'd change clothes immediately after the shootings to minimize blood spatter evidence, keeping the bloodied clothing in a separate bag that he later planned to dispose of. He'd researched motels without security cameras in Kansas City and specifically chosen the Starlight for its lack of surveillance in the parking areas and room corridors. He'd timed the shootings for the early morning hours, when motel staff would be least likely to be patrolling and when other guests would presumably be asleep and less alert to unusual sounds. Every one of these decisions, Ward argued, showed Michael thinking like a criminal trying to avoid detection and prosecution, rather than like a frightened child acting in desperate self-defense. The level of sophistication in his planning, the contingency measures like the backup ammunition, and the steps taken to create alibis and avoid leaving evidence all pointed to someone who understood exactly what he was doing and knew it was wrong, which in legal terms meant he possessed the mens rea or guilty mind necessary for a first-degree murder conviction. But the defense had a completely different interpretation of the same evidence, one that would prove compelling to many legal experts and child advocates, even if it ultimately didn't sway the jury. James Moretti argued that what prosecutors characterized as adult-like criminal sophistication was actually the hypervigilance and survival-focused planning typical of severely traumatized children, particularly those who'd been victims of Munchausen by proxy abuse. Children subjected to medical torture often develop advanced understanding of medical systems, procedures, and documentation as a survival mechanism, learning to monitor their environment obsessively and plan carefully because any mistake or oversight might result in more pain, more procedures, more abuse. Michael's careful planning wasn't evidence that he was an unusually sophisticated criminal. It was evidence that his entire childhood had trained him to anticipate obstacles, consider consequences, and plan meticulously, because his life had literally depended on his ability to navigate complex adult systems without making errors that would give his mother more ammunition against him. The ballistic calculations that seemed so damning weren't proof of criminal intent, but rather the application of a naturally curious and mathematically gifted child's problem-solving skills to the most desperate problem he'd ever faced: how to end the torture he was experiencing without causing harm to innocent bystanders in neighboring rooms, a concern that actually demonstrated moral reasoning and empathy rather than cold-blooded calculation. The journal's final entries, written in the days immediately before the murders, provided the most emotionally devastating evidence in the entire case, regardless of which side was citing them. Michael had written that his mom thought he didn't know about the blog, his dad thought he didn't know about the money, and they thought the doctors hadn't told him the truth yet. But tomorrow they would understand he'd known everything for months. He'd described overhearing his parents discussing plans to institutionalize him at a facility called Lakeside, where they would have complete medical control again and where staff wouldn't question their decisions the way some doctors had started to. He'd written that he'd tried 6 times to get adults to believe him and help him, but every time either nothing happened or things got worse when his mother found out he'd tried to tell. His final entry, dated the morning of the murders, stated simply that he had to do this today because they were coming to get him tomorrow. And once he was locked up in that place with them controlling everything, nobody would ever believe him, and he'd be stuck there until they finally succeeded in killing him, the way they'd killed Uncle Timothy. This entry would become the centerpiece of the defense's argument that Michael had acted not in cold-blooded premeditation, but in desperate self-preservation, genuinely believing based on substantial evidence that he faced a choice between killing his abusers or being killed or permanently disabled by their ongoing abuse with no possibility of rescue or escape. The revelation that would transform the Michael Turner case from a tragic story of child abuse and desperate violence into something far more sinister came from an unexpected source: Margaret Pearson, Reeba Turner's 76-year-old estranged mother, who took the witness stand on the fifth day of testimony with trembling hands and a determination to finally speak a truth she'd been carrying for over a decade. Margaret testified that she hadn't seen her grandson or her daughter in almost 3 years when she heard about the killings on the news, having been cut off completely by Reeba after she began questioning why Michael always seemed to get worse after visits and why his symptoms never quite matched what Reeba described on the phone. But it wasn't just Michael's situation that had troubled Margaret. It was the haunting echo of another child's mysterious illness and death, a pattern she'd recognized but had been unable to prove until forensic science finally caught up with her suspicions. Margaret told the hushed courtroom that her daughter Reeba had engaged in similar behavior with her younger brother Timothy, who had died at Lake of the Ozarks in 2009 at just 9 years old, and that she believed Reeba had been practicing her deadly form of abuse for far longer than anyone had realized. Timothy Pearson's death had been ruled natural at the time, attributed to an undiagnosed seizure disorder, but Margaret had harbored suspicions for years that something more sinister had occurred. Timothy had been fine that morning at the lake, playing on the beach and enjoying the family vacation. But after lunch, which Reeba had insisted on preparing for him separately because of his supposed allergies, he'd become violently ill, begun having seizures, and died before the ambulance could arrive. The patterns Margaret described were identical to what Michael would later experience: vague symptoms that doctors could never quite pinpoint, dramatic improvements when Reeba wasn't around, followed by sudden deteriorations when she returned, and a series of mysterious medical crises that seemed to intensify over time. Margaret had tried raising concerns with doctors and family members, but Reeba had skillfully deflected suspicion by telling everyone that Margaret was becoming senile and jealous of her mothering abilities, effectively isolating the one person who might have protected Timothy and later Michael. The old woman's voice broke as she described watching her son suffer through countless unexplained illnesses throughout his childhood, all of which seemed to worsen when he was alone with his sister Reeba, who was 12 years his senior and often acted as his caretaker when Margaret had to work double shifts as a nurse's aide. Following Michael's arrest, Margaret had made the extraordinary decision to petition the county where Timothy was buried to exhume his body for toxicology testing, a request that had been quietly granted 2 weeks before her courtroom testimony. The preliminary results had come back just hours before she took the stand, and what they revealed sent shockwaves through the Kansas City courthouse. Dr. Robert Harding, the medical examiner who conducted the tests on Timothy's preserved remains, testified that toxicology analysis showed 5 different medications in the boy's tissues, 3 of which were prescription drugs that should not have been in his system and which could in combination cause the seizures and cardiac arrest that had been listed as his cause of death. The medications found included benzodiazepines, calcium channel blockers, and beta blockers, heart medications that would have been available to Margaret's husband through his own prescriptions and that Reeba, living in the household as a 21-year-old, would have had access to. Based on these findings, Dr. Harding had amended Timothy's death certificate to classify his death as a homicide by poisoning, transforming what had been Margaret's long-held suspicion into documented fact and suggesting that Michael Turner had killed not merely abusive parents, but a mother who was likely a serial killer and a father who had enabled her crimes against both her brother and her son. The discovery of Reeba's childhood diaries provided even more disturbing context for understanding the origins of her deadly behavior. Margaret testified that she'd found a box of Reeba's things while cleaning out her deceased husband's storage unit the previous month, including journals Reeba had kept from ages 13 to 16. In these diaries, written in the careful handwriting of a teenage girl, Reeba had documented what she called her experiments, detailed accounts of giving various substances to neighborhood pets to observe their reactions, clinical descriptions of symptoms, and time to death, and later entries about administering her father's heart medication to Timothy when he was just a toddler to see how it would affect him. The journals, now in police custody and undergoing forensic authentication, painted a picture of someone who had begun experimenting with poisoning from adolescence, systematically testing different substances and methods long before Michael was born. One entry from when Reeba was 15 described giving her father's medication to Timothy, then age 3, and noted with apparent satisfaction that the resulting symptoms were interesting and that nobody suspected anything because the child was already considered sickly. These teenage writings suggested that Reeba's behavior wasn't a sudden development of Munchausen by proxy syndrome in adulthood, but represented a lifelong pattern of deriving satisfaction from causing illness and controlling others through medical manipulation. The prosecution attempted to contain the potential damage this revelation might do to their case by establishing that Michael couldn't have known about this generational pattern of abuse or the circumstances surrounding Timothy's death. Bailey Ward's cross-examination of Margaret Pearson focused on confirming that she'd never discussed her concerns about Timothy's death with Michael, having been cut off from contact with her grandson before she'd fully connected the patterns herself. Margaret reluctantly acknowledged that she had no evidence Michael had been aware of his uncle's death, or that his grandmother suspected foul play, which allowed Ward to argue that this historical context, while deeply disturbing, could not have factored into Michael's decision-making or mental state at the time of the murders. The prosecutor maintained that regardless of whether Reeba had killed before, Michael had no way of knowing this when he planned and executed his parents' deaths, and therefore it couldn't serve as justification or mitigation for his actions. But this argument felt increasingly hollow to many observers as the full scope of Reeba's deadly history came into focus. Even if Michael hadn't known the specific details of Timothy's death, he'd been living with a serial killer who'd already successfully murdered one child and was actively in the process of killing another. Dr. Vanessa Clark, a leading expert on Munchausen by proxy syndrome, testified that the condition represents one of the most dangerous forms of child abuse, precisely because perpetrators typically present as ideal devoted caregivers while systematically harming or killing their victims. What makes this abuse particularly insidious, Dr. Clark explained, is that the perpetrator receives not only attention and sympathy, but often tangible rewards, financial support, social media followers, community recognition, all while actively harming the child who serves as their ticket to validation. The abuse becomes addictive, with perpetrators needing to create increasingly dramatic medical crises to maintain the desired level of attention and support, which explains why these cases often escalate over time until the child either escapes, is rescued by authorities, or dies from the cumulative effects of the abuse. Dr. Clark referenced research showing that Munchausen by proxy has one of the highest mortality rates of any form of child abuse, with studies suggesting that as many as 9% of victims die as a direct result of the abuse, and those who survive often suffer permanent physical and psychological damage. In cases where the perpetrator has killed before, as appeared to be true with Reeba Turner, the risk to subsequent victims increases substantially because the perpetrator has learned what methods work, how to avoid detection, and has already crossed the psychological threshold that prevents most people from taking a human life. The psychological impact on child victims of Munchausen by proxy abuse creates what Dr. Clark described as an impossible dilemma for the developing mind. These children have been gaslighted their entire lives, told they are ill when they feel well, subjected to painful and frightening medical procedures they don't understand, and often isolated from peers who might offer contrasting perspectives. When they begin to suspect the truth, they face a devastating choice. Either their trusted caregivers are deliberately harming them, a reality too terrifying for many children to accept, or they must doubt their own perceptions and experiences, which undermines their fundamental sense of reality and self-trust. This creates profound psychological trauma that manifests in various ways, including dissociation, hypervigilance, and in some cases explosive violence when the child finally accepts the full horror of their situation. Dr. Clark testified specifically about Michael's case, explaining that his discovery of his mother's blog and the videos documenting his own suffering would have constituted a massive psychological shock, the moment when all the confusing pieces suddenly clicked into place, and he understood with terrible clarity that the person who was supposed to protect him above all others had instead been systematically torturing him for years, while thousands of strangers watched and applauded her devotion. The revelation that Reeba had potentially killed Timothy added a crucial element to the defense's argument about Michael's state of mind at the time of the murders. While Michael may not have known the specific details of his uncle's death before he killed his parents, his journal entries showed that he'd discovered references to Timothy in his mother's old blog posts and had begun asking questions about what had happened to the uncle he'd never met. One entry from 2 months before the murders described finding a folder on his mother's computer labeled Timothy's Journey that contained draft blog posts about another sick child's battle with mysterious symptoms, posts that had never been published, but that made Michael wonder if his mother had done this before. Another entry described overhearing his grandmother's name mentioned in an argument between his parents, with his mother saying Margaret was crazy and had always been jealous, and that they couldn't let her poison Michael's mind with her delusional accusations. These fragments didn't give Michael the full story, but they gave him enough to suspect that there might be a pattern, that his mother's behavior toward him might not be an isolated incident of abuse, but part of something larger and more terrifying. When combined with his discovery of his mother's teenage diaries in that storage box, which he'd secretly accessed during a rare visit to his grandmother's house before Reeba cut off all contact, Michael had pieced together enough information to genuinely fear that he might be following in Timothy's footsteps toward a death that would be ruled natural or accidental while his mother moved on to her next victim. The transformation of public opinion following these revelations was dramatic and immediate, with media coverage shifting from questions about whether Michael deserved to be tried as an adult to whether he should have been charged with murder at all. Child advocacy groups argued that Michael Turner wasn't a murderer, but a survivor who had acted in legitimate self-defense against a serial killer who'd already taken one life and was actively in the process of taking another. Legal experts debated whether the traditional elements of self-defense doctrine needed to be expanded to account for situations like Michael's, where the threat wasn't a single imminent attack, but an ongoing pattern of life-threatening abuse with no foreseeable end. Outside the Kansas City courthouse, the protesters who had been calling for harsh punishment grew quieter, while those demanding justice for Michael doubled in number, many carrying signs that read Reeba was the killer, and Michael saved himself. The discovery that Timothy Pearson had been murdered by his sister using the same methods she later used on her own son created a narrative that was impossible to ignore. Michael Turner hadn't killed his parents in cold blood. He'd ended the reign of terror of someone who'd been perfecting her methods of child murder for over a decade, and he'd likely saved his own life by doing so. The Jackson County Courthouse in downtown Kansas City buzzed with unprecedented security measures as the jurisdiction hearing for State of Missouri versus Michael Turner commenced on a cold October morning just 30 days after the double homicide at the Starlight Motel. National media had descended upon the courthouse with satellite trucks lining the streets and reporters jostling for position on the stone steps, where prosecutor Bailey Ward had first announced her controversial decision to seek adult charges against the 12-year-old defendant. Inside the wood-paneled courtroom, Michael appeared almost lost in his oversized navy blue suit, his feet barely touching the floor as he sat beside his court-appointed attorney, James Moretti, a veteran defense counsel who had successfully argued against juvenile defendants being tried as adults in 3 previous high-profile cases. Judge Raymond Blackwell, a former prosecutor with 27 years on the bench and a reputation for strict sentencing, peered down at the slight boy from his elevated position, his expression inscrutable as the gallery filled with journalists, psychological experts, and curious members of the public who had lined up before dawn to secure seats for what local newspapers had already dubbed the poisoned child murder trial. Prosecutor Ward's opening argument laid out a case for adult jurisdiction that focused relentlessly on the extensive evidence of premeditation while acknowledging but ultimately dismissing the abuse Michael had suffered. She argued that the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated these murders were not the impulsive act of a child, but the calculated execution of a plan developed over months with clear understanding of consequences. Ward walked the jury through Michael's journal with its detailed ballistic calculations, motel floor plans, and staff schedules that would ensure privacy during the commission of murder, arguing that the level of premeditation evident in these materials demonstrated an adult capacity for planning, deception, and understanding of both legal and physical consequences. She displayed the timeline showing Michael's cash withdrawals over 4 months, his research into motels without security cameras, his advance booking of rooms under false names, and his methodical steps to avoid leaving forensic evidence, all pointing to what she characterized as sophisticated criminal planning incompatible with the impulsive emotional reactions associated with juvenile offenders. Ward acknowledged that Michael had suffered terrible abuse, but she maintained that trauma, however severe, does not negate criminal responsibility when the defendant demonstrates such clear understanding, deliberate intent, and calculated planning in executing his crimes. Defense attorney Moretti's response was equally powerful, but approached the question from a fundamentally different perspective, one that challenged the very framework Ward was using to evaluate Michael's actions. Moretti strenuously objected to trying his client as an adult, arguing that Michael Turner was by every biological and developmental measure a child who'd been subjected to years of documented medical torture by his mother, who systematically poisoned him for psychological and financial gain with his father's knowledge and complicity. The defense attorney argued that expecting a 12-year-old boy who discovered his parents were deliberately making him ill and planning his institutionalization to possess the emotional regulation, impulse control, and moral reasoning of a fully developed adult was a position that not only contradicted established neuroscience on adolescent brain development, but ignored the severe trauma that provided essential context for these tragic events. Moretti displayed medical records documenting over 40 hospitalizations and hundreds of unnecessary medical procedures that Michael had endured since age 5, procedures that had caused him genuine physical pain, dangerous side effects, and social isolation, all orchestrated by his mother with his father's compliance, asking the jury whether a child forced to become an expert in his own supposed medical condition as a survival mechanism might naturally develop analytical skills beyond his years without possessing adult-level criminal sophistication. The battle of the experts that would dominate much of the trial began with the prosecution calling Dr. Philip Adamson, director of forensic psychology at the Missouri State Criminal Justice Center, who testified that despite Michael's young age, the extensive planning documented in his journal demonstrated cognitive maturity and moral reasoning typically associated with much older individuals. Dr. Adamson walked the court through Michael's ballistic calculations, which correctly accounted for shotgun spread patterns at close range to ensure shots wouldn't penetrate motel walls and potentially harm occupants of neighboring rooms, arguing that these calculations showed not only mathematical ability but consequential thinking and moral reasoning, more advanced than typically observed in early adolescence. The prosecution's neurological expert, Dr. Amanda Chen, acknowledged that adolescent brains differ structurally from adult brains, particularly in prefrontal cortex regions responsible for impulse control and consequence assessment, but argued that Michael's case represented an anomaly where his actions demonstrated exceptional cognitive development in these areas, suggesting his brain development might be accelerated beyond his chronological peers, at least in areas related to planning and executive function. The defense's counterattack came through Dr. Robert Sanderson, director of pediatric neuroscience at Johns Hopkins University and author of landmark studies on adolescent brain development, who used sophisticated three-dimensional models to walk the jury through the biological limitations of the adolescent brain in areas related to impulse control, risk assessment, and emotional regulation. Dr. Sanderson testified that it was a biological fact, not a theoretical position, that the prefrontal cortex remains developmentally incomplete until the mid-20s, and that regions responsible for judgment, decision-making, and understanding future consequences are physically incapable of processing information the way an adult brain does until they fully mature. He then addressed the specific conditions of prolonged trauma, explaining that chronic stress and abuse create distinct patterns of neural development that prioritize survival over optimal decision-making, with brain scans showing that abused children's brains physically differ from non-abused peers in ways that enhance threat detection while impairing development in regions responsible for emotional regulation and consequence assessment. When severe prolonged trauma is added to an already incompletely developed system, Dr. Sanderson explained, the impact is profound. What the prosecution presents as evidence of adult-like calculation is actually more consistent with a traumatized child experiencing dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism common in abuse victims that can create an appearance of calm detachment that has nothing to do with actual emotional state or criminal sophistication. The emotional climax of the expert testimony came when the defense called Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a leading expert on Munchausen by Proxy syndrome, who had evaluated Michael extensively since his arrest. Dr. Montgomery introduced the concept of trapped victim syndrome, describing it as a psychological state where a victim perceives, often accurately, that all conventional escape routes have been blocked. She testified that Michael's journal entries in the months before the homicide showed methodical exploration of every legitimate avenue for help, all of which had failed. He'd reported the abuse to teachers who dismissed his concerns, to doctors who relayed his complaints back to his mother, to online counselors who suggested he was confused about his medical needs, and even to a child protective services hotline that closed his case without investigation after Reeba convinced the caseworker that Michael's claims were medication-induced delusions. Each failure reinforced his perception that he was completely trapped in a life-threatening situation with no institutional protection available, and his final journal entries showed a child who believed, based on substantial evidence and experience, that he faced a choice between killing his abusers or being killed or permanently disabled by their ongoing abuse with no realistic possibility of rescue by the adult systems that should have protected him but had repeatedly failed. The prosecution's strategy of calling followers of Reeba's blog as witnesses proved to be a double-edged sword that ultimately may have hurt their case more than helped it. Sharon Matthews, a kindergarten teacher who had donated nearly $2,000 to Michael's supposed medical fund and organized school fundraisers on his behalf, testified while wearing a custom T-shirt with Reeba's photo and the slogan, "Justice for a Mother's Love." She described feeling violated and betrayed upon learning that the beautiful story of a mother's devotion she'd followed for years was actually an elaborate deception, and she expressed anger at Michael for murdering the woman who she believed had devoted her life to caring for him. But during Moretti's gentle cross-examination, Matthews reluctantly acknowledged that the person who had actually betrayed her trust and misused her generous donations was Reeba Turner herself, who'd been using the funds while actively poisoning the very child Matthews thought she was helping. Several blog followers testified about their emotional and financial investments in Michael's fabricated medical journey, but the defense successfully reframed their testimony to show that they and Michael shared a common experience. All had been manipulated and exploited by Reeba Turner for her personal gain. All were victims of an elaborate deception, and their anger at being deceived was perhaps misdirected at the wrong person. The presentation of Reeba's blog videos and the filmmaker's documentary footage provided some of the most emotionally powerful moments of the trial, with the defense playing selected clips showing Reeba tearfully describing Michael's non-existent cancer diagnosis, filming him vomiting violently after what she called treatments, but what medical experts now believed were deliberately administered toxins, and recording him unconscious in hospital beds, surrounded by equipment that later investigation revealed had been largely unnecessary. Moretti told the court that this wasn't just a record of abuse, but a mother documenting her torture of her child for an audience of thousands, receiving not just emotional validation, but financial rewards for her cruelty, and that Michael had discovered these videos 4 months before the killings, videos of his own suffering being exploited for his mother's gain, videos that made him realize the illness that had dominated his entire childhood was a fiction created by the very people responsible for his protection. One particularly devastating clip showed Reeba interrupting Michael mid-sentence during a filmed interview, cutting him off when he began to express something genuine, and replacing his words with her own narrative about his supposed fears and hopes. A moment of control and silencing that several jurors found deeply disturbing as it played out on the courtroom monitors. The testimony regarding Michael's attempts to seek help before resorting to violence became crucial to the defense's argument that he'd exhausted every legitimate option before concluding that killing his parents was his only viable escape. Pamela Rodriguez, a home health nurse who'd been assigned to the Turner home for 3 months, testified that she'd begun documenting discrepancies almost immediately in a personal journal separate from her official notes after becoming suspicious of Reeba's behavior. Michael would be fine when Mrs. Turner wasn't home, but would suddenly develop vomiting, fever, or extreme fatigue shortly after she prepared his medication smoothies that she insisted on making herself rather than allowing Rodriguez to administer his prescribed medications directly. When Rodriguez raised concerns with her supervisor, Reeba filed a complaint claiming she was neglectful and incompetent, resulting in her reassignment from the case and effectively silencing someone who'd recognized the abuse. Similar testimony came from Dr. James Chen, an oncologist who'd briefly treated Michael before requesting a transfer of the case due to inconsistencies in reported symptoms and diagnostic results, When Chen implemented protocols to prevent Reeba from being alone with test samples, Michael's blood work suddenly normalized. Showing no signs of the leukemia Reeba claimed had been diagnosed elsewhere, but when Chen requested complete records from the diagnosing physician, Reeba abruptly withdrew Michael from his care and transferred to another hospital system. These testimonies painted a picture not of a system about to rescue Michael, but of individual professionals who'd recognized something wrong but had been systematically thwarted by Reeba's manipulation, and the diffuse, uncoordinated nature of a medical system that allowed her to simply switch providers whenever suspicions arose. The prosecution's closing argument at the jurisdiction hearing emphasized that even accepting all the evidence of abuse and trauma, the law recognizes that in exceptional cases, juvenile offenders can and should be held to adult standards of accountability when their actions demonstrate adult-level understanding and intent. Ward argued that Michael Turner's journal, his internet search history, his financial transactions, and his methodical execution of these killings all demonstrated a level of planning and awareness that went far beyond typical adolescent capacity, and that justice required holding him accountable for his choices despite his age and victimization. But Moretti's response proved equally compelling to many observers. He asked the jury what options Michael actually had, reviewing the timeline of his failed attempts to get help, his discovery of evidence suggesting his mother had killed before, his overhearing of plans to institutionalize him where the abuse would continue beyond hope of intervention, and asking whether justice is served by trying a 12-year-old victim of prolonged documented torture as an adult for acting to end his suffering when all adult systems designed to protect children had failed him completely. The question before the court, Moretti summarized, wasn't whether Michael Turner committed these homicides, that fact wasn't in dispute, but whether he suddenly became an adult because his actions were violent, or because his planning was methodical, or whether his actions represented the desperate measures of a trapped child who saw no other escape from continued torture and impending permanent institutionalization, where his chances of rescue would disappear entirely. The courtroom became a graduate-level seminar in neuroscience, trauma psychology, and child development, as both sides called renowned specialists to address the fundamental question that would determine Michael Turner's fate. To what extent could a 12-year-old who had suffered years of documented medical abuse form the mental state required for premeditated murder? The prosecution's expert, Dr. Gregory Pearson, presented detailed analysis of Michael's journal, highlighting passages that demonstrated what he called sophisticated planning inconsistent with typical adolescent cognitive capabilities, arguing that the ballistic calculations showing correct accounting for shotgun spread patterns, the advanced booking of motel rooms under false names, and the methodical steps taken to avoid detection all suggested moral reasoning and consequential thinking more advanced than normally observed in early adolescence. Dr. Pearson walked the court through specific entries that showed Michael considering alternative courses of action and their likely outcomes, including one from August 27th where Michael wrote that if he reported his parents again, they'd just convince everyone he was delusional and finally put him away for good. And if he ran away, they'd find him and everything would get worse. So he had to end this permanently, analysis that Pearson characterized as evidence of cognitive maturity beyond chronological age rather than the desperate reasoning of a traumatized child seeing no other escape. The defense's counter-narrative centered on the well-established science of adolescent brain development and the specific neurological impacts of prolonged trauma, with Dr. Robert Sanderson methodically dismantling the prosecution's contention that Michael's planning demonstrated adult-like criminal sophistication. Using colorful brain scans and three-dimensional models, Dr. Sanderson showed the jury that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and decision-making, remains physically underdeveloped until the mid-20s, making it biologically impossible for adolescent brains to process information the way adult brains do, regardless of how intelligent or precocious the child might be. When severe prolonged trauma is added to this already incomplete developmental system, Dr. Sanderson explained, the impact is profound and specific. The brain adapts by remaining in heightened states of alert, triggering the release of stress hormones that physically alter brain development by enhancing pathways related to threat detection while impairing development in regions responsible for emotional regulation and consequence assessment. In layman's terms, he testified, the brain sacrifices optimal development to keep the child alive in a threatening environment, which means that Michael's apparent calm and detachment after the killings, which the prosecution presented as evidence of adult-like calculation, was actually more consistent with a traumatized child experiencing dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism that allows abuse victims to function by emotionally disconnecting from overwhelming experiences. The specific neurological impacts of Munchausen by proxy abuse became a crucial focus of expert testimony, with Dr. Sarah Lindstrom, a nationally recognized expert on childhood trauma and neuropsychological development, explaining that this form of abuse creates particularly severe brain development impacts because it involves medical trauma, physical pain, and profound betrayal by caregivers in a uniquely toxic combination. This isn't just physical abuse or just emotional abuse, Dr. Lindstrom testified. It's a perfect storm of trauma factors that creates neurological changes, prioritizing escape and survival above all other considerations. The child experiences genuine physical pain and illness from unnecessary procedures and medications, psychological disorientation from being told they're sick when they feel well or vice versa, social isolation that prevents reality checking with peers who might offer alternative perspectives, and the fundamental betrayal of having the people who should protect them actively causing their suffering while the world applauds the abuser's devotion. Children who survive this form of abuse often develop what appears to be precocious understanding of medical systems, careful planning abilities, and hypervigilance about potential threats. But these aren't signs of accelerated maturity or criminal sophistication. Their survival adaptations developed because the child's life literally depends on understanding the systems being used to harm them and anticipating what might happen next so they can try to protect themselves. The prosecution attempted to undermine the defense's neuroscience testimony by focusing on the fact that the vast majority of children who suffer severe abuse, even abuse as horrific as Michael's, never respond by committing premeditated murder. Dr. Amanda Chen testified for the prosecution that while it was true adolescent brains differ structurally from adult brains, and while trauma does affect neurological functioning, these facts didn't negate criminal responsibility in cases where the defendant's specific actions demonstrated exceptional sophistication in planning and execution. Bailey Ward pressed Dr. Sanderson during cross-examination, getting him to acknowledge that even among severely traumatized children, the level of planning and calculation exhibited by Michael represented an unusual response, allowing Ward to suggest to the jury that Michael's actions were exceptional, even within the population of abuse victims, and therefore deserving of exceptional legal consequences. But Moretti countered this argument by calling Dr. Naomi Parker, a specialist in trauma-informed forensic evaluation of juvenile offenders, who testified that what the prosecution characterized as consciousness of guilt was actually consistent with behavior of severely traumatized children who'd learned through bitter experience that adults in authority wouldn't believe or protect them. Michael's methodical planning reflected not adult-like criminal sophistication, but the hypervigilance and survival focus typical of chronically traumatized children who'd learned that any mistake or oversight would result in further harm. The psychological concept of learned helplessness and its relationship to Michael's ultimate decision to use violence became a key point of expert disagreement. with prosecution experts arguing that Michael's careful planning over months contradicted any claim of learned helplessness or desperation, while defense experts maintained that the planning actually demonstrated the opposite. A child who'd learned that conventional help-seeking didn't work and who'd methodically explored and exhausted every alternative before reluctantly concluding violence was his only viable option. Dr. Eliza Montgomery walked the jury through the concept of trapped victim syndrome, explaining that victims in Michael's situation often engage in extensive planning precisely because they've learned that impulsive actions lead to failure and increased abuse, so they approach their escape with the same careful attention to detail they'd been forced to develop as a survival mechanism throughout their abuse. The journal entries showing Michael systematically exploring legitimate avenues for help, reporting to teachers, confiding in doctors, calling hotlines, all documented with dates and outcomes, supported the defense narrative that his eventual turn to violence wasn't a first choice, but a last resort after every proper channel had failed. Montgomery testified that Michael's final entries showed a child who believed, based on substantial evidence, that he faced imminent institutionalization at a facility where his parents would have complete medical control and where his chances of anyone believing him would effectively disappear, creating a situation where, from his perspective, waiting for the slow wheels of institutional intervention meant almost certain continued torture or death. The courtroom heard extensive testimony about the specific timeline that had pushed Michael from planning to action, with particular focus on the overheard conversation about Lakeside, the residential facility where his parents planned to place him. Audio recordings that Michael had secretly made on his phone captured his parents discussing how, once he was at Lakeside, they'd have complete medical control again, and the staff wouldn't question their decisions the way some doctors had started to. Ernie Turner's voice on the recording expressed concern that Michael was getting too old and asking too many questions, making their situation increasingly difficult to manage, while Reeba responded that the institutionalization would solve all their problems by giving them controlled access to him without outside interference, and that they could probably continue the blog by framing it as his brave battle in residential treatment for behavioral issues related to his illness. The defense argued that for Michael, hearing this conversation was the tipping point. It wasn't just a threat of continued abuse, but a concrete plan that would make escape or rescue essentially impossible, and combined with his recent discovery of evidence suggesting his mother had killed her brother Timothy using similar methods, he genuinely believed he was facing a choice between killing his abusers now, while he still had any chance to act, or being permanently imprisoned in a facility where they could continue poisoning him until they succeeded in killing him, as they'd apparently killed Timothy. Dr. James Mitchell, a specialist in medical ethics who had reviewed all the evidence in Michael's case, provided testimony that proved devastating to the prosecution's narrative by framing the question not in terms of Michael's sophistication, but in terms of institutional failure. Dr. Mitchell testified that in his 30 years of practice, he'd never seen a more systematic case of medical child abuse than what was inflicted upon Michael Turner, describing the 327 unnecessary medical procedures over 7 years as essentially a prolonged campaign of medical torture disguised as health care. But what made the case even more ethically troubling, Mitchell testified, was the comprehensive institutional failure that had allowed this torture to continue despite multiple warning signs and the concerns of several medical professionals. The medical system that should have protected this child instead became the instrument of his torture, Mitchell stated. And when Michael finally discovered the truth and attempted to advocate for himself, he encountered a systemic failure that left him with no realistic path to safety. He'd reported concerns to nurses who smiled and told him his mom loved him and he needed his medicine to get better. He'd confided in teachers who relayed his complaints to his mother. He'd called a child protection hotline that closed his case after Reeba explained he was having medication-induced delusions, and he'd witnessed doctors who'd started to ask questions being skillfully manipulated by his mother into backing down or being avoided through provider switching. From an ethical standpoint, Mitchell testified, Michael's actions must be viewed in the context of this comprehensive institutional failure. He didn't kill his parents merely to avoid abuse, but because every system designed to protect children like him had already failed him completely, and he'd heard concrete plans to place him where the abuse would continue indefinitely beyond any hope of intervention. The final expert testimony focused on the question of whether Michael's actions could legitimately be understood as self-defense, despite occurring while his parents slept, rather than during an active attack, with competing theories about how imminence should be defined in cases of ongoing abuse with no foreseeable end. The prosecution's behavioral analyst, Dr. Trevor Marshall, testified that regardless of trauma, the specific manner in which Michael carried out the homicides, waiting for his parents to fall asleep, standing approximately 3 feet from each bed, firing execution-style shots, demonstrated this was not self-defense, but calculated revenge, murder committed not to stop an immediate attack, but to permanently silence his abusers and punish them for years of mistreatment. But the defense countered with Dr. Eleanor Marvin, a child psychology specialist who argued that traditional self-defense concepts developed for adult-on-adult violence don't map well onto situations involving child victims of prolonged abuse by caregivers who control every aspect of their lives. Michael didn't have the option of simply leaving the situation the way an abused adult partner might flee a domestic violence situation, Dr. Marvin testified. He was a 12-year-old child completely dependent on his parents for food, shelter, medical care, and every other necessity of life, and his mother had spent years ensuring he was isolated from anyone who might help him while systematically destroying his credibility with authority figures by framing any complaints as symptoms of his supposed illness or side effects of his medications. From that perspective, Marvin argued, Michael's entire existence had become a state of perpetual, imminent danger. Every meal could contain poison, every doctor's appointment could lead to unnecessary, painful procedures, and he'd just learned he was about to be placed in a facility where this torture would continue beyond any possibility of rescue. So the question wasn't whether he faced an imminent threat requiring immediate action, but whether he reasonably believed, based on his experience and evidence, that waiting would only give his parents more time to implement their plan, to institutionalize him, and continue the abuse that might ultimately kill him as it had apparently killed his Uncle Timothy. The tension in courtroom 302 of the Jackson County Courthouse in Kansas City was palpable as Judge Raymond Blackwell entered at precisely 9 that morning, his black robe swaying slightly with each deliberate step toward the bench after 4 days of jury deliberation, the longest in the county's recent history for a juvenile case. Michael Turner sat at the defense table looking even smaller than usual, his small frame nearly swallowed by the oversized suit that had become a visual reminder throughout the trial of his youth, in stark contrast to the adult charges he faced, while defense attorney James Moretti placed a protective hand on his client's shoulder as the jury filed in with expressions that gave nothing away, after what court observers had described as intensely emotional deliberations, evidenced by sounds of raised voices occasionally escaping from the jury room over the past 4 days. Judge Blackwell's voice cut through the silence as he reminded everyone that regardless of personal feelings about the case, appropriate decorum would be maintained when the verdict was read. Then nodded to the court clerk who approached the jury foreman, a retired high school principal, who had remained stoic throughout the trial. To receive the sealed verdict that would determine whether Michael Turner would be held accountable as an adult for the deaths of his parents, or whether his age and circumstances would afford him some measure of protection under juvenile justice standards. The foreman's voice was steady but carried an undertone of emotion as he read the verdict that would spark immediate controversy and protests across the nation. In the case of the state of Missouri versus Michael Turner on the charge of murder in the first degree of Reeba Turner, we the jury find the defendant guilty, and on the charge of murder in the first degree of Ernest Turner, we the jury find the defendant guilty. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom, but before any reaction could fully form, the foreman looked directly at Judge Blackwell and added that the jury had a unanimous recommendation regarding sentencing that they would like to present to the court, an unusual step that suggested the panel had struggled deeply with their decision. Michael showed no visible reaction to the verdict beyond a slight slumping of his shoulders, the same detached composure he'd maintained throughout most of the trial, while in the gallery behind him some spectators wept openly, and others nodded in grim satisfaction, a microcosm of the national conversation that had divided America over whether this traumatized child deserved punishment or protection, accountability or mercy, justice or compassion, in a case where all the traditional legal categories seemed inadequate to capture the moral complexity of what had occurred at the Starlight Motel that October morning. The week between verdict and sentencing witnessed unprecedented public discourse about juvenile justice, with legal experts, child advocates, mental health professionals, and political figures all weighing in on the appropriate punishment for a 12-year-old convicted of murdering his abusive parents. Media coverage revealed that the jury's sealed recommendation had urged consideration of Michael's age, trauma history, and potential for rehabilitation in determining his sentence, a recommendation that held no legal weight but reflected the jury's evident struggle with the case's moral dimensions and their desire to communicate that guilty verdicts didn't mean they believed Michael deserved the same punishment an adult would receive for similar crimes. Outside the Kansas City courthouse, opposing rallies were held daily with advocates for juvenile justice reform, carrying signs reading, "Trauma is not a crime, and children deserve protection, not prosecution," while a smaller but vocal group demanded justice for Reeba and Ernie and held placards declaring adult crimes deserve adult time and murder is murder regardless of age. The intensity of public feeling on both sides led courthouse security to double their presence, with officers stationed throughout the building and designated areas established for demonstrators to prevent confrontations between the opposing groups whose emotions had been running increasingly high as the sentencing date approached. When sentencing day finally arrived, the courthouse had taken on the atmosphere of a major national event. With the security measures, including metal detectors at every entrance, officers stationed throughout the building, and a separate overflow room established for viewing via closed-circuit television. Because the main courtroom couldn't accommodate all the media representatives and interested observers who'd arrived to witness the decision. Michael entered looking as though he'd slept little since the verdict, with dark circles under his eyes and a pallor that made him appear even younger and more vulnerable than he had during the trial. While his attorney had filed a comprehensive sentencing memorandum arguing for placement in a juvenile treatment facility rather than adult prison, citing Michael's age, history of severe abuse, expert testimony regarding his rehabilitation potential, and the ongoing trauma symptoms he continued to experience even in the relative safety of juvenile detention. Before formal sentencing began, Judge Blackwell allowed victim impact statements, a procedure that would prove emotionally wrenching as family members of both Reeba and Ernie Turner offered sharply contrasting perspectives on what justice should look like in this impossible case where the victims were also perpetrators and the perpetrator was also a victim in ways that defied easy moral categorization. Margaret Pearson approached the podium with the aid of a cane, her lined face showing the weight of having lost her daughter to murder, her son to what now appeared to be murder by that same daughter, and potentially her grandson to the justice system's inability to adequately account for the full complexity of his situation. She told the court she couldn't and wouldn't excuse what Michael had done because taking a human life is wrong regardless of circumstances. But she begged the court to remember that he'd acted after years of torture disguised as medical care, after discovering evidence that his mother had likely killed before using the same methods she was using on him, and after hearing plans to place him where the abuse would continue beyond hope of intervention, asking whether, if ever there were mitigating circumstances that should influence sentencing, surely they existed in this case. Ernie Turner's brother Charles offered a sharply contrasting perspective, his voice rising as he spoke, not to the judge, but directly to Michael, stating that his brother may have been complicit in his wife's abuse and deserved punishment, but legal punishment through the courts, not execution by a child who'd appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner, and that accepting trauma as justification for premeditated murder meant abandoning the rule of law entirely. Charles Turner demanded the maximum sentence allowed by law to send a message that no circumstances, however tragic, justify taking matters into one's own hands through violence. Prosecutor Bailey Ward's sentencing argument acknowledged the case's complexity while maintaining that the methodical planning evident in these homicides, the ballistic calculations, the advanced hotel bookings, and the steps taken to avoid detection, demonstrated a level of premeditation and awareness that demanded significant consequences regardless of the abuse that preceded them. Ward told the court that the law must balance compassion for Michael's suffering with accountability for the calculated taking of 2 human lives, and that while the state recognized Michael had endured years of documented medical abuse that no child should experience, the evidence showed he'd made a deliberate choice to plan and execute these murders over months rather than pursuing other available options, and that choice had consequences that couldn't be dismissed simply because he was young or had been victimized. Defense attorney Moretti delivered an impassioned final plea that focused on a continue 7.26 p.m. simple question he asked Judge Blackwell to consider. What should a 12-year-old child do when subjected to years of medical torture, when every attempt to report the abuse is dismissed or punished, and when he discovers plans to place him in a facility where the abuse will continue indefinitely? Moretti argued that his client hadn't chosen violence as a first resort, but as a last desperate measure after every system designed to protect children had failed him completely, and that punishing him with decades in adult prison would victimize him a second time, sending a message to every abused child in America that the law offers no protection, no justice, and no mercy, even in the most extreme circumstances of victimization. Judge Blackwell called an unusual 30-minute recess before delivering his sentencing decision, a step that court observers interpreted as reflecting the exceptional nature of the case and the judge's awareness that his decision would have implications reaching far beyond this single courtroom, potentially influencing how juvenile justice systems across America approach cases involving severe abuse and young offenders for years to come. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had become almost unbearable, with Michael sitting utterly still at the defense table while camera operators adjusted their equipment to capture what had become one of the most closely watched sentencing decisions in recent American legal history, and spectators in the gallery leaning forward in their seats as Judge Blackwell entered looking grave, his normally impassive judicial demeanor showing subtle signs of the emotional weight of the decision he was about to render. The judge instructed Michael to rise, and the boy stood alongside his attorney, his head barely reaching Moretti's shoulder, presenting a visual that would be broadcast around the world. A child in an oversized suit standing before the bench to learn whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison for killing the parents who'd spent years torturing him. Judge Blackwell began by acknowledging facts that were not in dispute. that Michael had suffered years of severe medical abuse at his mother's hands with his father's knowledge and complicity, that he'd attempted multiple times to report this abuse through appropriate channels only to be disbelieved or punished, that he'd discovered evidence suggesting his mother had previously killed her brother using similar methods, and that he'd overheard plans to institutionalize him where the abuse would likely have continued beyond hope of intervention. The judge removed his glasses and made direct eye contact with Michael, stating that these circumstances were among the most tragic he'd encountered in 27 years on the bench, that no child should endure what Michael endured, and that the systemic failure of adults and institutions that should have protected him was a stain on the collective conscience that society must address. For a brief moment, it seemed Judge Blackwell might be leaning toward leniency, a possibility that caused visible tension in the prosecution team and audible stirring in the gallery, but the judge's expression hardened as he continued, stating that none of these mitigating factors, individually or collectively, justified the premeditated taking of 2 human lives. Judge Blackwell referenced several passages from Michael's journal showing planning over months, stating that the evidence revealed not panic or immediate fear for life, but a calculated decision to kill his parents rather than pursue other available options, and that Michael had researched ballistics to ensure his shots wouldn't harm individuals in neighboring rooms, methodically accumulated funds, booked accommodations under false names, and taken steps to avoid detection, all indicators of premeditation and consciousness of guilt that couldn't be ignored simply because the defendant was young or had suffered abuse. The pronouncement came with a finality that seemed to suck the air from the courtroom. Michael Turner, after considering all evidence presented at trial, all aggravating and mitigating factors, the jury's recommendation, and the sentencing guidelines established by the state of Missouri for juvenile offenders, tried as adults, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words sent shockwaves through the gallery with audible gasps and at least one cry of protest, while Michael's face remained expressionless, almost as if he'd expected this outcome, or perhaps as if the dissociative mechanisms that had protected him throughout his abuse and trial had kicked in again to shield him from the full emotional impact of learning he would never be free. Judge Blackwell continued over the disturbance, stating that Michael would serve his sentence in the Missouri Department of Corrections Specialized Unit for Juvenile Offenders until age 18, at which time he would be transferred to the general adult prison population, a detail that caused child advocates in the courtroom to openly weep as they contemplated this 12-year-old boy spending his teenage years in juvenile detention before being moved to adult prison, where he would remain for the rest of his natural life without any possibility of parole, redemption, or second chance. The judge's final statement would later be quoted in law school textbooks and judicial opinions nationwide, as courts grappled with similar cases involving juvenile offenders and severe abuse. This court wishes to make it abundantly clear that this sentence is not merely punishment for Michael Turner, but a message to society at large. We have created a system where children like Michael must resort to violence to escape abuse because every legitimate avenue for protection has failed them. And until we address these systemic failures in our medical institutions, our child protective services, and our legal frameworks for addressing child abuse, we will continue to see tragic cases like this one. Judge Blackwell stated that Michael Turner's crime was heinous, but that society's collective failure to protect him was equally so, and that his sentence should serve as an example not just of the consequences of taking human life, but of the urgent need to reform the systems that had failed him so completely that a 12-year-old child concluded his only escape from torture was murder. The sentencing of Michael Turner to life without parole triggered immediate and widespread protests across the United States, with child advocacy organizations filing emergency appeals within hours of Judge Blackwell's decision and mental health professionals issuing open letters condemning what they characterized as a fundamental miscarriage of justice that demonstrated the legal system's complete failure to understand the psychological reality of severely abused children. Outside courthouses in major cities from New York to Los Angeles, demonstrators gathered carrying signs demanding justice for Michael and chanting that trauma is not a crime, while online petitions calling for clemency or a new trial gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures within the first week. Legal experts were sharply divided in their reactions, with some defending the sentence as a proper application of existing law that acknowledged both the severity of Michael's crimes and the premeditation evident in his planning, while others argued it represented a moral and legal failure to adequately account for the extraordinary circumstances of a child who'd been systematically tortured for years and had exhausted every legitimate avenue for help before concluding violence was his only escape. The case had exposed deep fissures in American society's understanding of criminal responsibility, childhood trauma, and the limits of the justice system to deliver truly just outcomes in cases that defied easy categorization as either straightforward murder or justifiable self-defense. Several state legislators announced plans to introduce what became known as Michael's Law proposals, legislative efforts to create special provisions for child victims who commit crimes against their abusers under circumstances involving severe documented abuse and institutional failure to provide protection. These proposed laws would establish protocols requiring courts to consider neurological evidence about adolescent brain development, create presumptions against trying juvenile abuse victims as adults except in the most extreme circumstances, and mandate comprehensive reviews of how child protective services and medical systems had failed before allowing prosecution of children who'd acted violently against abusive caregivers. Supporters of these legislative efforts argued that the Michael Turner case had revealed catastrophic gaps in legal frameworks that were designed for adult offenders rather than traumatized children, and that without substantial reform, the justice system would continue producing outcomes that punished victims twice, once through the abuse they suffered, and again through the legal consequences of their desperate attempts to escape that abuse. Opponents countered that creating special protections for juvenile offenders who killed their parents risked sending a dangerous message that undermined parental authority and could be exploited by genuinely violent youth looking for justifications for their crimes. 3 months after sentencing, as Michael Turner began serving his life sentence in the juvenile wing of a Missouri correctional facility, an unexpected development brought his case back into the national spotlight and provided new ammunition for those seeking to have his conviction overturned or his sentence reduced. The forensic testing of Timothy Pearson's exhumed remains had been completed with unprecedented thoroughness, and the results confirmed conclusively that he had died from deliberate poisoning with medications available to Reeba through her boyfriend Ernie, even back in 2009 when Timothy was killed. Dr. Robert Harding's amended death certificate officially classifying Timothy's death as a homicide by poisoning transformed the narrative from Michael having killed merely abusive parents to having killed a serial killer mother and her enabling accomplice father, which advocates argued should have been considered as part of the sentencing decision since it demonstrated that Michael had genuinely faced not just abuse, but a legitimate threat to his life from someone who'd already successfully murdered one child using exactly the method she was employing against him. Appeals attorneys immediately filed motions for sentence reconsideration based on this newly confirmed evidence, arguing that Michael's belief that his mother intended to kill him and that his father would allow it to happen was not paranoid delusion, but reasonable conclusion based on documented facts that should have been weighed more heavily in determining appropriate punishment. The conditions of Michael's incarceration became a subject of intense scrutiny and concern among child welfare advocates who argued that placing a severely traumatized 12-year-old in any correctional facility even when designated for juvenile offenders, amounted to continued abuse by the state that would only compound the psychological damage he'd already suffered. Reports from the facility indicated that Michael had become increasingly withdrawn, speaking rarely even to counselors and spending most of his time reading or staring at walls in his cell, behavior that psychologists warned was consistent with deepening depression and trauma responses that weren't being adequately addressed despite the facility's claims of providing mental health services. The prospect of his transfer to adult prison at age 18 caused particular alarm, with experts testifying in appeals hearings that moving a young man who'd spent his formative teenage years in juvenile detention into the general population of an adult maximum security prison would expose him to almost certain violence, exploitation, and further traumatization that would make any possibility of rehabilitation or healing essentially impossible. The American Psychological Association filed an amicus brief in support of Michael's appeal, arguing that sentencing a child to life without parole, particularly a child who'd acted under circumstances of severe documented abuse and institutional failure, violated evolving standards of decency and contradicted everything modern science understood about adolescent brain development, trauma, and the capacity for change and growth even in youth who'd committed serious crimes. The national conversation sparked by Michael's case extended well beyond debates about his specific sentence to broader questions about how society identifies and responds to medical child abuse, with particular focus on the systemic failures that had allowed Reeba Turner's torture of her son to continue for 7 years, despite multiple warning signs. Congressional hearings examined the gaps in communication between medical facilities that enabled perpetrators of Munchausen by proxy abuse to avoid detection by switching providers, with lawmakers proposing legislation to create national databases that would flag patients with suspicious patterns of emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and provider changes that might indicate medical child abuse. Medical licensing boards implemented new training requirements for doctors to recognize warning signs of Munchausen by proxy, while children's hospitals across the country established specialized child abuse protection teams specifically focused on identifying cases where caregivers might be fabricating or inducing illness in their children. Child Protective Services agencies faced intense scrutiny about their failure to adequately investigate Michael's reports of abuse, leading to policy reforms requiring more thorough follow-up on complaints from children themselves, rather than dismissing their concerns when parents provided alternative explanations, particularly when those parents were articulate and appeared devoted. The blog community that had unknowingly funded and emotionally supported Reeba Turner's abuse of Michael struggled with their own complex feelings of guilt, anger, and betrayal in the aftermath of the case. Many of Reeba's most dedicated followers felt complicit in her crimes despite having acted with genuine compassion, and several required counseling to process the realization that their donations and emotional support had enabled torture they'd believed was devoted maternal care. Some blog followers established a foundation in Reeba's memory, an action that sparked controversy and anger from those who believed memorializing someone now known to be a child murderer was inappropriate and offensive, while child advocacy groups organized a scholarship fund for young survivors of medical child abuse in Michael's name, trying to ensure that some good might come from this tragedy by helping other victims access education and opportunities that Michael's life sentence had essentially denied him. The case transformed how medical fundraising blogs and social media health advocacy accounts were viewed, with increased skepticism about unverified medical claims and growing awareness that not every sympathetic story of a devoted parent caring for a sick child was genuine, a development that unfortunately also created difficulties for legitimate families dealing with children's serious illnesses, who found their fundraising efforts met with suspicion and demands for extensive documentation. The legal appeals process moved slowly through the Missouri court system, with Michael's attorneys arguing multiple grounds for overturning his conviction or reducing his sentence, including inadequate consideration of his age and development at trial, failure to properly instruct the jury on self-defense as it applies to victims of ongoing abuse, newly discovered evidence about Timothy Pearson's murder confirming Reeba's status as a serial killer, and constitutional challenges to sentencing juveniles to life without parole in cases involving severe documented abuse and trauma. The appeals process would likely stretch on for years with potential review by the Missouri Supreme Court and possibly the United States Supreme Court. If constitutional questions about juvenile sentencing were accepted for consideration, meaning that Michael might spend much of his adolescence in legal limbo, neither definitively condemned to die in prison nor offered any realistic hope of eventual freedom. Support for Michael's cause grew as various religious organizations, mental health advocacy groups, and even some victims' rights organizations that typically supported harsh punishment for violent offenders joined the chorus calling for mercy, arguing that his case represented exactly the kind of extraordinary circumstances that should prompt courts to look beyond rigid application of sentencing guidelines to consider the full humanity and specific context of the individual being punished. Inside the juvenile facility where Michael served his sentence, staff members reported a profoundly damaged child who seemed to have retreated into an internal world where he could survive psychologically, if not heal, occasionally emerging to participate in educational programs or counseling sessions, but mostly maintaining the same detached composure that had characterized his demeanor since the night of the murders. Psychologists who evaluated Michael at regular intervals noted that he showed no signs of sociopathy or lack of empathy. In fact, he expressed genuine remorse, not for killing his parents, but for any pain his actions had caused to others, including the blog followers who felt deceived and betrayed, and he demonstrated appropriate emotional reactions when discussing abstract injustices or the suffering of others, even if he seemed emotionally disconnected from his own circumstances. These evaluations supported the defense team's long-standing argument that Michael wasn't a dangerous psychopath, but a severely traumatized child whose actions had emerged from specific circumstances of abuse and institutional failure rather than from any inherent violent tendencies or lack of moral development, making him an ideal candidate for rehabilitation in a therapeutic setting rather than punishment in the punitive environment of prison. Yet despite these professional assessments, the legal machinery ground forward with Michael's transfer to adult prison looming when he would turn 18, a prospect that advocacy groups described as tantamount to a death sentence, given the violence and exploitation that awaited traumatized youth in adult correctional facilities. The question that haunted observers of the Michael Turner case, the question that sparked arguments at dinner tables and in college classrooms and in legal seminars across America, remained fundamentally unanswered despite the verdict and sentence. When a child has exhausted every legitimate avenue for protection from life-threatening abuse, when the systems designed to protect the vulnerable have comprehensively failed, when the choice appears to be between violence and continued torture that might end in death, how should the law respond? Is such a child a murderer deserving of life imprisonment, or a survivor deserving of protection, treatment, and eventually a chance at redemption and a normal life? The Michael Turner case had no easy answers, only the troubling reality that a 12-year-old boy who'd been systematically poisoned and tortured for years by parents who'd already killed one child sat in a cell facing the prospect of dying in prison while the systems that had failed to protect him continued operating largely unchanged, ready to fail the next Michael Turner, who would inevitably appear unless fundamental reforms addressed the gaps and dysfunctions that had made this tragedy possible. And perhaps that was Judge Blackwell's real message in his sentencing statement. Not that Michael deserved to spend his life in prison for surviving his own torture, but that society deserved to confront its collective failure to protect its most vulnerable members, a failure so complete that a child had concluded murder was the only path to safety, and that conclusion had been tragically, devastatingly, almost certainly correct.